Hello and welcome to Lecture 19 as we examine 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 8 through 15. Therefore I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Therefore is an indicator of a special frame or the context, and it's simply that Paul is again talking about public worship. And what's going to follow, therefore, is a picture or an explanation of what faithful worship should look like within the Christian church. This is what Paul has to say about men. They are to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. So in the early church, there was a little bit of an evolution eventually where our worship services would have the pastor would be the one appointed to lead the worship and to read the readings and to preach a sermon. Those elements are there from the beginning, but in the very early church, you would have an environment where more than one person could speak publicly. And this is what Paul is talking about, the men praying. That's that public prayer. Isn't it interesting, though? He has some words about not doing that with anger or disputing. What does that mean? Was there people kind of vying for positions of leadership within these early churches? And again, remember, there's not a specific way yet for people to become pastors per se. In other words, they don't have seminaries. And so there's a little bit of a process here. And certainly men should not be vying for or competing unduly with others, and certainly not arousing anger and disputing amongst themselves. The word for men there is a technical word in the sense that we know very clearly what it means, aner or andros. It cannot be translated just as people, or you can't translate it as men and women. In that sense, it's not just a word for like mankind, but it is a word specifically for men, not only the gender, but it also excludes young men. So boys are not included in that. So again, this means that the men, the older people, the people that are mature men, are there to be the ones leading and actively speaking within the worship service. Verses 9 through 12 explain about the roles of women. Verses 9 and 10 really talk about dress and jewelry and so forth, but the point here is not so much about a type of a hairstyle or clothing or jewelry, but it's really what's going on in the interior of the heart and the mind of the women. So just as Paul had something to say about men, of how they were to conduct themselves, don't arouse anger, don't dispute with one another. That's what he said for men, and women should not be competing or comparing themselves based on their jewelry and dress. Verses 11 and 12 are very important. And they really kind of play on each other. In other words, verse 12 rather unpacks or explains verse 11 and vice versa. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. So what does that mean? Well, it means that a woman is not to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. So what does this mean? And again, it is all about the role of women in public worship and in the life of the church. So one thing that is a little bit difficult, but we can be clear on the matter, is in our English translations, the two words assume authority in the Greek is simply one Greek word, authentane. And this is a word that only occurs one time in the New Testament. So you can't pull up many different verses to kind of get a feel for how that word is used in different contexts. It's a hapax legomenon. It only occurs this one time. But nevertheless, we understand what it is. It's having an authority, a role of authority. One thing about the NIV 2011 is it translates it as assume authority. That's how it renders that one Greek word. That has aroused some discussion because it seems to open up a door in a bad way. Therefore, I have the ESV version there, where it translates that one Greek word with the two English words to exercise authority. So assume authority versus exercise authority, you see how those really bring about a different understanding in the English. Paul talks about why. Why are women not to play that role of leadership? Well, verse 13 focuses on that. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And remember, Eve was created as a helpmeet, a companion to Adam. That doesn't mean she's a second-class citizen. It just means that within society she plays a specific role. And this understanding of male headship, this teaching, is the principle is that women are to submit to men. The application here is that women are not to teach when it is an exercise over a man. That second part of that verse is interesting. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Well, what does that mean? Really, when we take a look at all of this, Adam is the one to be blamed, and Adam is talked about as the first sinner. And when Paul talks about this in Romans, it talks about how sin came through Adam into the world. Adam failed in his role as a leader. And look at that negative result. Remember, when Eve received that fruit, who did she hand it to? She handed it to Adam, who was right there. And he was not doing his job. So we want to keep this in context about how sin entered in the world with a breakdown of the roles of men and women. Verse 15 is simply hard. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. How do you understand this? Well, one understanding is that giving birth has historically had a high mortality rate. And the idea here is that women, the pain, the danger associated with childbirth ever since the fall, and has been, in essence, a curse upon women, is not something that will continue to be a burden on them. In other words, it's really addressing Genesis 3:16. It's not here saying that women will no longer experience pain when they give birth to a child, but it's really just addressing what God said in Genesis 3:16 about the association with now the fall into sin with the pain of childbirth. But even here, it doesn't really unpack what Paul is saying in this verse. And so a second way of understanding this is that childbearing refers to the one birth, the birth of Jesus the Messiah, who brought salvation to all, including women. But there too, it does not seem to be a real clear explanation of what is being communicated here in verse 15. It is just simply a difficult text. The most important thing, obviously, is women, like men, like everybody, they have to be in faith. That's the important thing when it comes to salvation. And if you have faith in Jesus, you will be saved. So that much we know with total clarity. Here's some false teachings or arguments against the principle that women cannot exercise authority over a man within the church. So in other words, how have others, dealt with these verses? What about these churches that ordain women? What do they do with these verses? Here are a couple of different things, 4 in particular. One is they'll simply say Paul was wrong, and so we don't have to listen to him. Well, of course, Paul is inspired by the Holy Spirit. The words here are in the Bible. So that is a really, really bad argument. A second bad argument was that Paul was speaking about something in his own day and not something for all Christians, for all ages. It was wrong then, but not wrong today. Things evolve. So again, this is how some churches will explain away these verses, that things are different now than it was in Paul's day. But remember, what did Paul say in this text? I want men everywhere. In other words, it's meant to be a generalized principle for all times and in all locations. And the male headship principle is not limited to one time or area. 3, Paul was speaking only about husbands and wives, not the dynamics within a congregation. Well, that's a bad argument because everything in the context there is about the public worship service. He's not talking about homes. And 4, based on that NIV translation of assuming authority, some have falsely concluded that women can be pastors as long as they don't assume it or take it for themselves, but receive it from men. So in other words, it'd be wrong for a woman to try to be a pastor, but if a woman says, well, you should do that, well, then it would be okay. So again, these are 4 bad arguments that try to undo or write off what Paul has taught. Lessons and points from this text. Paul is speaking about public worship, and he is speaking about the roles of men and women within this context. 2, men are to pray during the public service. They are worship leaders. Now again, that doesn't mean any man can just get up and start leading a worship service. That's not what is being convened. But anybody who is a leader has to come from within the men of the congregation. There was indeed a certain evolution in all of this as formal pastors arose eventually within the congregation. Think about the situation in Corinth where Paul references different people speaking within a worship service. Number 3, women are to have a beauty from within rather than an outward physical beauty. Again, the point here is not so much about clothing one way or the other, but on the true heart of the matter. What is going on in the heart of Christian women? Point 4, the principle of male headship applies within the Christian congregation. It was not something that was true only for Timothy's original hearers or for Paul's own day. So what is being talked about here is, universal for the whole church. But very important is number 5. Through all of this does not mean that women can't serve, and it doesn't mean that they cannot participate in the ministry of the word. It just means that they cannot do so when they are exercising authority over a man. So, questions and points for discussion. 1, why has our culture made discussions about the roles of men and women so difficult today? 2, women can serve within the church, just as long as they do not exercise authority over a man. It's not a question, but it is something we can talk about. What does that look like? 3, the teaching of male headship is meant to be a blessing and not a burden to the Christian church throughout the ages. Again, not a question, but something for us to talk through. And lastly, agree or disagree. As a general rule of thumb, women do like it when men take the lead. Again, you have your right to agree or disagree. That's something that we can talk further about. Thank you for your time and have a blessed day.